Good day and welcome to Glasnost in Our Time, where we try to look at the world rationally in the hope that it will look rationally back. I'm your host, Anthony D'Agostino. It's October 10th, 2024. Russia seems confident that it's winning in Ukraine, so much so that it is boldly moving into the explosive situation in the Mideast. Israel is fighting in Lebanon. It's exchanging missile strikes with Hezbollah, Yemen, and Iran. The wars in the two theaters are threatening to become one. In the present alignment, strange to say, China is an onlooker. The US election will take place in the midst of all of this world crisis, and the election may or may not be a referendum on US foreign policy, but the winner will have big questions to decide on war and peace. And by the way, both sides in the election can find a way to accuse the other of being the party of the rich. Are the rich more powerful, and are they richer than they have ever been? Are the rich resented, or are they admired by the rest of us? We're hoping to have a philosophical and historical discussion about these things with Guido Alfani, author of A New History of Western Wealth. Alfani is professor of economic history at Bocconi University in Milano. He has published many works on social stratification, plagues, calamities in European history. We want to talk about his book, As Gods Among Men, A History of the Rich in the West, published in 2023 by Princeton University Press. Alfani writes that the position of the rich is intrinsically fragile. So we're going to want to ask him about some of these things. Welcome to Glasnost, Guido Alfani.
Thank you very much, Professor D'Agostino. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So I thought I would kick off our conversation by asking you something about the way we feel about the rich, deference toward the rich. In one of P.G. Wodehouse's books about Jeeves and Wooster, there's a passage where a friend of Jeeves makes some complaints about the way the rich behave. And Jeeves bristles at this. He bristles and he says, on the contrary, he says, we must preserve and treasure our lords and ladies. That's always been the prevalent attitude, hasn't it? Don't you think that's a kind of a continuity through history?
Well, the point is also who are the rich in different societies, right? Because in our history, deference was first and foremost addressed towards nobility, where, of course, in societies where there was a formal nobility. But the rich commoners actually have always been looked with quite a bit more suspicion. Because, from the Middle Ages, the point was, okay, if you were a noble and you had more resources than the others, it was clear why you had them. It kind of corresponded to how society was organized. And the idea was also that these correspond to God's plan for a well-organized society. But the theologians in the Middle Ages said, okay, but what about these commoners who become very wealthy? What's the reason of their wealth? Because they could use it to help the poor, right? So the point is, in that case, there was no deference at all. The problem was they were considered basically sinners. Then, of course, this starts to change. But I would say deference towards the rich wasn't based only on their wealth until pretty recently. Our society today tends to look at the very rich much more as models or even as heroes than societies in the past, right? So this is also something which, again, develops historically.
So interesting. You argue that there's a tendency toward inequality that is more or less a constant, or one might see it as a constant, with only certain periods when there's a little more leveling. The tendency toward inequality is the norm, and the lessening in inequality is the aberration.
Yeah.
So does that mean that we're part of a cycle and we can expect maybe a cycle of lessening, or I should say a period of lessening of inequality at some point? Or does it mean that there's a more or less a continuum and there's only been this one
Yes.
aberration during the period of the world wars? Or, sometimes they say the Trente Glorieuses, the glorious years of prosperity after World War. It's more or less in that period that we find a lessening of inequality. So how do you see this as a motion of history?
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, first of all, we can more or less measure wealth inequality when we are very lucky. We can measure it for about 7 centuries. When we are very lucky, we can begin with the early 14th century, which is very good because it's right before the Black Death, a terrible plague which kills half the people in Europe and the Mediterranean. Now, I don't think that we can really, I mean, I don't think it is very meaningful to describe that the tendency we observe in terms of cycles. I see this much more as a constant tendency towards wealth inequality to grow. And we also have some information about income, and this seems to be to some degree the same story. But if we really talk about the longer run, we have much better data about wealth. And so, wealth inequality tends to grow over these 7 centuries, and we can find only 2 phases of generalized decline in wealth inequality. The first one is triggered by the Black Death in the 14th century. And the second one begins, as you said, with World War I. Then, of course, there is World War II and whatever happens between the world wars. And then it continues for about 20 years after the end of World War II, right? And these are the exceptions. So you can give
Excuse me.
Yeah.
May I quibble about one little thing before you proceed? I don't know why I'm asking this, but don't you count the 30 Years' War as part of that? So it continues up to about the middle of the 17th century.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is the 30 Years' War, so 1618 to 1648, was able to lead to leveling, so a reduction in wealth inequality, as far as we know, only in the German area, right? Because it doesn't happen in, say, different Italian states. It doesn't happen in South France. The only area where we have evidence of a decline in wealth inequality in that period is the German area, and that's due to the combination of the 30 Years' War and the worst plague after the Black Death in the 1620s. So we can't disentangle the impact of war and plague in that context. I mean, we can try, but it's very complicated. But for now, that's the only part of Europe where we have evidence of the second phase of inequality decline. And then from the second half of the 17th century, again, we find these this resumption of the tendency for wealth to become more concentrated. Yeah. But that's only Germany. I mean, we haven't researched
Germany.
you
say, yeah. Don't you have a Germany on a graph that it's a tendency toward how should we put this, toward leveling, or at any rate a level tendency, from 1300 to 1800, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you have
Germany is very level.
Yeah, but if you really look at the graph, you see that the trend is exactly the same as, say, Italy until 1600, and then you have the second phase of decline, and then it resumes growing. But as it was declining before, it remains by the end of the early modern period at a lower level, basically. So, as we are talking about catastrophes reducing inequality and causing leveling, so plagues, wars, and these kind of things, you could give a very, say, pessimistic interpretation of this, which is to say, okay, so wealth inequality tends to grow across history. It's kind of a natural process. And, in the end, the cure is worse than the illness because we don't want a catastrophe in order to reduce inequality. But my personal interpretation is actually more optimistic because I tend to highlight the fact that in the 20th century, inequality continues to decline for about 20 years after the end of World War II. And also, if you look at the World War periods that the decline in inequality of both income and wealth was due also, well, not only to the destruction of financial capital and of physical capital, basically, but it was also due to policies which were actually redistributing resources. They were giving rights to people, so the extension of the franchise. They were starting to provide better education across the board. So, it's really a change in how society is organized. Then after the end of World War II, in much of the West, you have the build-up of the welfare state systems. And interestingly, if you think about the early modern period, when, again, with the exception of Germany, we have this continuous tendency for inequality to grow, then I would argue that human agency matters a lot again. And in that case is, there are many factors at play, but one thing which surely plays a role is increasing per capita taxation in the context of regressive fiscal system. So again, inequality growth was also the consequence of how society was structured and how the ruling elites were shaping distribution, including by shaping how institutions were designed, right? So the point, my reading of this story is that human decisions matter a lot more than one could assume by looking only at what seems to be the direct impact of catastrophe. But the impact of catastrophe is big time mediated by institutions. So it's kind of, again, also the outcome of human agency, human decisions.
So we could call this the era of the world wars and the Cold War, or couldn't we say the era of the Russian Revolution, or the rise of the socialist movement at the end of the 19th century and its transformation and transmutation during World War I? Instead of Germany becoming the socialist country, it became Russia. So it's that roller coaster again. And now with globalization, we get this big increase in inequality. But that means that another war, another crisis, another disturbance of that sort will produce another aberration. If we are asking for less inequality, if we're advising it, as I think maybe you are, if we are proposing it, aren't we cutting against the idea that it only comes when there's a catastrophe?
Yeah. No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree that it only comes because of catastrophes. So, I personally think that, ceteris paribus, less inequality is better than more, of course. Then we could debate whether there is a trade-off between economic growth and inequality. I don't think there is, actually, but and I think history is pretty explicit, or pretty strong in suggesting that there is such a trade-off. But the point is this: of course, nobody would think about spreading a plague to reduce inequality. First thing. Second, if you think about crises, how many crises do you want? Because in this millennium, we had the financial crisis at the end of 2007, triggering the Great Recession from 2008. Yeah. In very lucky countries such as mine, which is Italy, we also had the sovereign debt crisis, which was, I can tell you, a really tough crisis. Then we had COVID-19. Now we have the crisis in Ukraine. So, how many crises do you want? And none of this reduced inequality in any Western country. So from this point of view, the point is, even if you just compare the Great Recession beginning 2007, 2008 with the Great Depression beginning 1929 with the crash of Wall Street, after that one, you have that the wealth share of the richest 1%, 0.1% declined, but after 2007, that didn't really happen. So, you have a large-scale crisis, but you don't have the same dynamic. And then the point is, the patrimony of the richest has become more resilient against crisis, which
more resilient, you say?
Resilient, yes. Against crisis, of course. And that's, you could argue it's a good thing, good for them. But then the question to me is whether that resilience is also obtained by avoiding to pay the kind of to pay a larger share of the bill of the crisis, right? Because in the past, very clearly until the world wars, one role that the rich played in society was during crisis to accept to contribute more than the others in different ways. And by the way, if they weren't willing to do it, they were systematically forced to do it in various ways, right? And this is a social role that the rich perform from the end of the Middle Ages until, at the very least, the end of World War II. But if you look at service of fiscal reform in OECD countries, if you look at my country or at your country, this didn't happen in the 21st century. So the rich haven't been made to contribute more than the others to foot the bill of the crisis in, again, even in the context of really unexpected events such as COVID-19. And there was a request from the bottom of society in Europe that was very clear, but nothing happened. So they didn't become a policy, right? And so, the fact that you don't have a reduction in inequality after the crisis of the 21st century is also because there hasn't been the will to, again, ask the most affluent to contribute more.
And you also write that there's a conception of politics as well, that there's an idea that you can have a heroic figure, a savior of last resort, Cosimo de' Medici or J.P. Morgan.
Yeah.
You compare those. Who has very interesting comparison. And they become, let's see, in the attitude of the historian, the opinion of the historians, Machiavelli and Guicciardini, they both said that Cosimo de' Medici was the father of his country. I mean, that country wouldn't be Italy, would it? It would be Firenze, right?
Yeah.
the father of his country, this great heroic figure who saves us. And Jamie Dimon, I think, talked this way about the masters of the universe in 2008, and how they came together and arrived at a policy that saved everyone. But the policy, when it's combined with the notion of quantitative easing, doesn't it make the rich into not providers, but wards of the state?
Yeah, absolutely. There has been kind of an inversion in the relative position,
and that's entirely new, isn't it?
And that's entirely new. I mean, in the case of Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo, at some point, he was exiled because the Republic of Florence charged him, his political enemies actually charged him with the intention of rising above the other citizens, right? So in 1433, he is exiled from Florence. Only the year after, he has to be called back because Florence risked going bankrupt over its war debt, and it lost a war against Siena. And that's when he's called back. His enemies are exiled in their turn, and is again welcome as the savior of the country, right? And that's also interesting because this is considered to be the moment when the so-called hidden seigneury of the Medici family in Florence begins, right? So really, he becomes the master of the state, and these descendants will become dukes of Florence. But if we want to, and then this role of saving the state from financial collapse is played. The case of J.P. Morgan is the most recent one I could make, and that's the famous story of his action at the time of the bank crisis in 1907, when faced with the threat of a run on banks on the Monday during the weekend, he convinced a group of financiers from New York in his private library in New York, which, by the way, today is a very nice museum.
Beautiful place, yeah.
Fantastic place, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he locks everybody in, and he tells these people, okay, you're not getting out until we find a solution to the problem. and they find a solution. They mobilize their financial resources, yes, but even more importantly, their relations and their the relational resources, and they are able to restore the faith in the survivability of the system before the end of the weekend. And then JP Morgan is hailed as the savior of his country, in all these letters he receives in the press and whatever. But the problem is, this was a democracy, a modern democracy. The United States were a modern democracy. And so, this display of financial power.
It also violates the rules of capitalism as well.
Yeah.
This is a moral hazard, is it not? Moral hazard on a vast scale.
Absolutely. Also because then the point is, if really there is this small group of people which can control, to this level, the finances of the state, what if they decide to do it for less, less noble reasons? And what if they decide to also start controlling politics, which is what American politicians of the early 20th century really feared? And then it's also because of this that in 1913 in the US, the Federal Reserve System is established to avoid that the United States ever again had to be saved by private money, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the point is, this was this burden on the shoulders, especially of the main financier of the past. So they were expected to be kind of willing to do something for the state if need be. But the moment we have this other system, and of course the problem is also that the budgets of the states grow enormously during the 20th century. So it's difficult to think that a private individual has the resources to save his country as Cosimo de' Medici did, even a small group like, at the time of JP Morgan. But more importantly, the moment you take away this role from the people who actually control finance, maybe you protect the state, you protect the public from a possible threat, but in a sense you also make them less useful to the public, to society, because they aren't expected anymore to do it. And then you get to 2007 and after, when we have seen private financial companies saving public money, across Western countries, and that's the opposite of what we've been talking about. Yeah, and that's also, that's historically, it's a very interesting development. It's really, I call it a U-turn in history, because you stop having private money saving the public, saving the state, and you have public money saving private banks, right? So this is really new historically, and possibly should also be the cause of some concern.
As I were to put it this way and generalize, I say, well, with regard to capital, there's a monopoly tendency in capital. But can we go a step further and say there's a rentier tendency in capital? It tends to become divorced from production.
Yeah.
And then maybe we could go a few more steps and say there's a gentrification. That is to say, it starts to take on kind of almost feudal, so to speak, feudal characteristics, not really, but, feudal characteristics. And perhaps lastly, that there's a kind of a Bonapartist tendency, that is to say, for tycoons to become leaders, Napoleonic, Trump, a Trump kind of tendency, Berlusconi, that sort of figure. Do you think that would be out of line, to put it that way?
No, I think this is an important point. This is also something which, along very similar lines, I discuss in my book. There is clearly a tendency for capitalism to develop monopolies if there is the opportunity. I think, again, when we want to look at change, and I think, again, it's very interesting to compare directly the beginning of the 20th century with the beginning of the 21st century. Right? So I was talking about this political concern about a small group of financiers who supposedly control the finances and the economies of the United States. And the point is, again, the display of financial power of JP Morgan in 1907 fueled suspicion against them, the so-called money trust. And in that period, the more forceful application of antitrust legislation also had, surely it had the objective of breaking down the monopolies where they existed, but it also served a political objective, which was, breaking down the power of this small group of people, because that is an economic power which might become a political power, and we have to protect democracy from them. Mm-hmm. So today we are not nearly as committed to fight monopolies, I would say. I mean, the application of antitrust legislation has been pretty weak compared to what we see and again at the turn of the 20th century. And there are many reasons for this, of course. One reason is that competition is more and more at the global level. So where do you define the monopoly, at the state level or the global level? And so, but there is maybe also a political side to this story, which might also have to do with what you described as this Napoleonic tendency of some, at least among the super rich, to try and take a leading, I think, assume a leading role. I mean,
magnificence. Huh?
Well, yeah, magnificence of sort, because magnificence is this idea of doing great deeds for the collectivity, but as a claim, but claiming at the same time that you also had a right to rule. Okay. So interestingly, I think that I mean, people like Berlusconi or Trump aren't magnificent in that sense.
They're not magnificent.
No,
they're not magnificent either, huh?
So it's not like, Cosimo de' Medici was in the 15th century really stood out for all the institutions he established, monasteries, churches, the first public library in Europe. It was a patron of the arts. These people weren't. I mean, Silvio Berlusconi had a football team. So he was the patron of a football team, which is important, maybe, of course, but I'm not a supporter of Milan.
So. It's like that in the United States too. The big tycoons all own big teams, and they have a lot of fun. But they don't run them you can't run them like a business, because if you ran them like a business, that means you would liquidate and you would lose. Yeah. You would lose.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's not magnificence. It's something different. It's more, again, the intention to shape even more directly policy. And then the question is not maybe why they want to do it. And of course, every individual is different, but you can speculate that in the case of Berlusconi, there was many suspicions that he, when he first ran for prime minister in Italy, and he got elected, his companies weren't doing particularly well. So there was also the suspicion he had some, economic interest, which was never demonstrated in a tribunal, by the way. So one needs to be careful about making this statement, but the suspicion was there. But apart from this, the question is not why they want to do it. I think maybe it's human that you believe if you can get elected, you believe you'll be good at the job. The point is more why the voters have become more accepting of a very direct involvement of the super rich, in particular in politics, than in the past. I think this is a change happening across the West. And I think this kind of allowed wealth to play a much more important role in politics, and then possibly also in shaping policies. And if that is true, then we might have one possible explanation of why in recent years, during the recent crisis, for example, even if many were asking to make the most affluent contribute more, this didn't become policy. That's a possibility. Of course, I don't have the smoking gun on this, but it's a question I think is at least worth asking. Then, if you want to talk about about the United States, I was very surprised at the debate which developed in your country about whether Walz was rich enough to run as vice
Was
president.
was he rich enough? Absolutely. Well, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting idea. The idea of deference. We think it's important. You have to have some money in order to be counted as, I don't know, really human. Yeah.
But you know, if we look at the tradition in political thought in the West, we can go back to Aristotle. Aristotle was saying, of course, in the classical period, and he was thinking about Athens, right? Athenian democracy. He was saying, if you want to be involved in politics, you have to be rich because you need to have spare time. Then, you know, we can move on in time, and Hamilton in the US, he was saying, you know, to be a politician, it's preferable if you have some wealth. You don't need to be very rich. You need to have some wealth, enough to be free if you want, right? Enough not to be easily blackmailed, not to fear losing your job. But then the point is, which is the level of wealth you need to have? A modest level of wealth, right? Somebody from a middling background fulfills that requirement. And I'm not saying that I agree with the requirement at all, you know, but if you really wanted to look for this, you don't need to be super rich, because the super rich have always been seen as a threat by the same political thought, the same tradition. Again, dating back to Aristotle. Aristotle was saying, if you have a democracy and if you have somebody who overcomes the others too much in virtue, and wealth could be one possible virtue, that person will be as God is among men. And I take the title of my book from here. Then the translators of Aristotle to Latin in the Middle Ages, people like Nicolas Oresme in the 13th century, they were making very clear in their translation, in their comments, that the issue was wealth. So, you know, when Oresme writes superabundantes in Latin, it's clearly the super rich. In fact, I translate it as super rich directly in my book, because it is very clear he's thinking about an excessive concentration of wealth in very few hands. And he was saying, again, if you really want to be in a democracy, then this is a problem, because again, this person will not have the same access to institutions as the others, right? And by the way, neither Aristotle or Oresme were, you know, particularly favorable to democracies. They only say, you know, you really want a democracy, so this is something you can't have. And this tradition remains there, right? So the super rich in politics have always been seen as a problem for a democracy. And, you know, more recently, you find this idea, for example, in the works by Thomas Piketty. And there is one point in the book when I place in sequence a text from Oresme, 13th century, and one from Piketty, 21st century, and they basically say the same thing, right? If you have an excessive concentration of wealth, you can't expect that everybody will really have the same access to institutions. So, you know, even if everybody has the same right to vote and the same right to be elected to top public office, if you have a common normal person and a super rich running for the same position, then, you know, the super rich might be in a better place to win, especially if like was very clearly the case for Berlusconi, for example, in Italy, especially if his sector of activities involved to a large degree the media, right? So the problem with Berlusconi, and this is something that again led to a lot of debate and polemics in Italy, was that he, when he ran for election, he was controlling half the television channels that in 1994 were operating at the national level. Plus, he was controlling many magazines, newspapers, and whatever. So he was really a media industry person, and he was using his medias to promote his campaign. And that's a problem, because you know, others would not be on the same footing as this kind of person. And that's not what you would expect from a theoretical, you know, the point is the theoretical equality of rights has become something very different in practice. And this is why, again, there is really a clear line connecting Aristotle to today political thinkers, and again, many examples in between, suggesting that the super rich are a problem. The fact of having some wealth sometimes resurfaces, but nobody, I think, ever questioned whether you need to be very wealthy, right, to run for the political position. So that's an interesting feature.
Really
and I think,
interesting.
yeah, it's interesting.
Stuff.
And I think this betrays a change in the way in which we think about the direct involvement of the very wealthy in politics. Again, we are more accepting of their direct involvement, to the point that we are surprised when those who run for, again, the vice presidency, in the case of Walz, aren't very rich, at least, or even super rich. But so it was a fascinating debate to me. I have to say that as a European, I found it strange. So Europe is not there yet, from this point of view. From the point of view of the super rich running for, absolutely. But from this point of view, we are not there yet. I don't know whether we'll get
your
there.
perspective with the book is the West. But you say that maybe if you looked at it in terms of the whole globe, you might think differently, and I certainly would think that there's something to that idea. If we look at countries like Russia and China, and big powerful countries that are sort of how do we put it? Well, they're opposed, or or at any rate, we are set against. The West is set against these countries these days in various geopolitical ways, but they don't have completely different systems, and they have quite a few billionaires in their countries, and maybe it gives rise to the thought that maybe there can be a separation, a model in which there's a separation between riches and power. Such as was described by the economist Werner Sombart, talking about imperial Germany at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. Imperial Germany said, well, the bourgeoisie, they can make all the money they want, they can become rich and powerful and celebrated, all the rest of that, but they do not enter into power. And the gentry, the nobility, they are the ones who have a monopoly of public office and public responsibility. There's a sharp division, and that would have been a model. So if Germany had ended up being some kind of big hegemonic power, if it had won World War I, maybe that idea would have been more of a model for the relations between the riches and power.
This is very interesting. I didn't know this statement by Sombart, but I could quote Max Weber on pretty much the same thing, the same topic, because Weber says something which I find very, very insightful. He says, when you have this new bourgeoisie starting becoming wealthy at the beginning of the early modern period, so, between the 15th and the 16th century, an agreement is reached between the old nobility with feudal origins and these people. And the agreement is, okay, we allow you to rise in terms of wealth, but we, the nobility, will keep the political power and some of our privileges, in particular in terms of in matters of taxation. We will be taxed less than you are. And this works, this actually, I think, explains much. And by the way, another thing that Weber was saying was that before that, the feudal system was setting inequality by construction at a relatively high level, but it was also preventing inequality from growing even further because it was actively keeping down these new commoners, these new rich commoners, right? It was preventing them from becoming too wealthy. So yes, when you have in Western history this separation between a ruling nobility and the groups which are at least some groups within this nobility with its ancient feudal origins, and a bourgeoisie which has wealth but doesn't have access to the real political power, then yes, you are basically doing exactly that. You are separating the concentration of power, or political power, from the concentration of economic power, which was exactly the concern that those critical of the money trust in the US 1 century and something ago had, right? And I think this is very important because this is something that maybe is becoming lost today. Yeah, and that's also a worrying thought. Now, if you wanted to look in history at cases where you have really in the same hands everything, those were the few republics of the early modern period, the patrician republics like Venice, like the Dutch Republic, yes. Because there you have the main merchants are the patricians, right? And interestingly, these are the places where really inequality can reach the highest levels because everything is in the same hands. I start to see the patrician republics as a pretty interesting case because I worry whether we run the risk of going back in practice to that kind of model, right? To have formally democracies which in practice work as a patrician republic. And I don't think that we should want to go there, right?
Yeah, like the United States, huh? You would think of the United States that way?
Well, I'm thinking about the West in general because I think that this is really a problem, a process which is happening across the board. But yes, I was also thinking about the United States.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm missing the point here, but by patricians, I think I'm missing the point in a way that the idea of a patrician has to do with power, has to do with the
Right.
definition of a power model, in which they create a state that is limited and under their control and et cetera. And so I don't know. Well, how would you classify, say, the Poles, the Szlachta democracy of the period prior to the partitions in the 18th century? Where the nobility ran everything, and and the bourgeoisie counted for nothing, and they're very weak central power. They like to invite foreigners in to run the country and
yes.
keep them busy with women and one thing or another and all the rest of that. Where would you put that kind of a thing? You could say, that the United States resembles a little bit more of that Polish model in its constitutional framework at the end of the 18th century. I don't know, somebody living at that time might have said, this is a constitutional model that you see in Europe only in England and maybe Poland, but not France. Not France. France would be the opposite, is that what you think of when you say patrician, or I'm missing the point, I think.
Yeah. No, when I say patrician, I think at places such as the Republic of Venice. Again, Venice, which is a republic run by the merchants, and the merchants at some point, become the patricians and make their status of patrician inheritable. But there was always the possibility of, if you were a new rich family, new wealth, there was always the possibility of buying your titles. You could, enter the group which was running the state. So the point is, in the context of a patrician republic, you have that the concentration of economic and political power is the same hands as in some feudal settings of the Middle Ages, right? Before the rise of the commoners and the bourgeoisie, if you want. But the point is, those people are very free to be entrepreneurial. There is no kind of cultural constraint today trying to make money. Very different, again, from the case of France, where a noble couldn't dirty his hands,
Right.
That they had these interesting ways to solve the problem of impoverishment of noble families. You could suspend nobility temporarily, make some money, and then ask, please, consider me a noble again now that I stopped doing, these dirty things. Anyway, so that's it. So the point is, to me, a patrician republic is kind of an example of a society which is ruled by the richest, but richest who are entrepreneurial, not the nobles, right? And the point is, the nobles had formally this connection to their subjects. It was in theory an exchange of protection versus submission, if you want. There was really a complex relationship. But for the patrician, the matter is different. Then the point is, if you want to talk about history, right? If you look as I did in, if you see as I did in a study I ran on the Republic of Venice, that inequality increases a lot throughout the early modern period. The point you have is with the poor. So what does it mean that the poor become poorer? Because if the poor were at subsistence, and they probably were in, say, the 16th century, they can't get access to resources. They can't lose access to resources without starving, and they will rebel and revolt, right, before dying of hunger. And they didn't, meaning, they were getting something back. They didn't own the land anymore. They didn't own anything, but they were getting something back by means of, charity. So the point is, this patrician who concentrated more and more of the overall wealth and the overall income of the country were also intensifying their charity. At the bottom, people were still able to eat and to feed their families, barely, right? But they were ever more dependent upon the goodwill of the rich. And that's, the point is, the way in which society was organized was changing, was becoming, I would say, nastier, sort of, right? So this is kind of worrying. I mean, and the paradox to me is that these are the republics, right? So the republics were more extractive, more unequal than a monarchy such as France, because, of course, in a monarchy such as France, you have a much stronger division of power, exactly like in the German case you were making earlier. That's the same thing, the same kind of again, division of the resources and
Division of
constraint.
labor.
Yeah.
Division of labor among the mighty.
Yeah, also division of labor. So it's like, you have different elites, but these elites then aren't able to rise so much above all others, because they are kind of checking each other, right?
Well, in the ideal, I mean, would you ask more of the rich? At the end of the book, you talk a little bit about, not enough for me, but I would love to hear more about this. But you talk about patronage, and I've forgotten the term you give for it. The ability to change the culture. And this, of course, refers to great figure like Cosimo, to absolutely change the culture. And how would that work today? Do you feel that there is a philanthropy that actually changes our culture or helps our culture in some way?
So, as you know, there is some sort of a debate about the nature of philanthropy. Right? Philanthropy is a concept which is basically developed from the late 18th century. And the idea is that if you're a philanthropist, you are making good to the others, gifts, basically, without getting anything in exchange. So this is a very different idea from magnificence that we were talking about before, right? You do something for the community, but you are also making a claim to have a right to rule. You are getting political influence in exchange. So from my point of view, the point is the following. When Cosimo de' Medici, after 1434, starts making all these good things for his citizens, everybody understood very clearly which was the kind of bargain they were offered, right? And my worry, my suspicion is that today we talk about philanthropy, we talk about giving. We tend to understand this as gifts, or if you want, again, to have a nice word, munificence, right? Which is making gifts. So magnificence means doing great deeds, and that's a political claim. Munificence means making gifts, but they're not the same thing, right? So the point is, are we considering these gifts while in fact they don't come for free, right? And then, maybe the concept of magnificence is better, because at least it makes explicit that by giving something, you're also getting something back, And it's kind of more honest, and it's clearer to a society which kind of bargain you're offering. Then, society will decide whether to take it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And there is another problem also, which is this. One thing is to make gifts, and another thing is to be willing to contribute more by means of, taxation, basically. Now, there is a tendency across the West to lower taxation and to make taxation less progressive. This has been going on for a long time. I will not discuss the theoretical rationale behind this, but it would only make the point that, even if you believe that this trend is good, it's still different to argue that during major crises of an unexpected kind, like COVID-19, you can't ask the most affluent to contribute more. So what really is striking to me, again, looking at the service of fiscal reforms in Western countries, that not even temporary measures could be introduced, like telling the richest people in one country, look, we are in dire straits, you can afford to help, please help us, because otherwise, we are going to have a problem financing policies to fight the crisis. So what happened instead is that many countries, all Western countries, I think, increased substantially their public debts. And then the problem is, if taxation is becoming less progressive, who's going to repay the public debt, right? So what I want to say is that it's not the same thing to give freely and to accept a duty to be available to help more during a crisis, accepting that it will be the state, the collectivity to decide how to use the money, right? And so the point is, are you willing to accept being taxed more during, say, COVID-19, even if you personally believe that the state will waste some of that money? The point is, you are fulfilling a kind of social contract, because the expectation that the richest help their communities in times of crisis has been there from the end of the Middle Ages. It was, in fact, I would say, the main role given to the richest to play in society when the medieval society and cultures tried to move away from this idea that all rich commoners were only sinners, right? So if they are not all sinners, then we can find for them a role in society and a place in society and a role to play. And that role was, first and foremost, this: being ready, being available to help, to contribute in different ways during crisis. But again, accepting that the government then will make the decision. So you provide the resources. While today, I have the strong impression that in the debate, and many super rich really put things in this way. They say we are better at using our money for good. That might be true, and they are. I would be very happy if they did it after having paid fair taxes.
Up to them to think that, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But after having paid their fair share of the taxes, especially again during crisis, because doing that, they establish a certain relationship with society as a whole, not by means of charity.
So Margaret Thatcher was wrong. She was wrong when she said there's no such thing as society.
She was absolutely wrong.
That's wrong. That's wrong. Yeah. Well, this is a fantastic discussion. This is all fascinating stuff, and I have a whole lot of other questions to ask Professor Alfani, but we have to break this off. We could go on for hours, of course, over a glass tea, but we have to conclude. So thanks to Guido Alfani for an illuminating discussion, and goodbye to all the listeners of, all the viewers of Glasnost. Until next time, when we will continue to ask the question, after we have tried everything else, why don't we try thinking about it?